everybody. This is Gareth Tarr for Brooklands TV. Today we are interviewing Crispian Besley about his book Driven to Crime, which is a series of stories about people involved in motorsport who have ended up with some sort of criminal activity, and it's about 60 odd chapters, but about 90 odd stories. So, Crispian, I think the best way to start is for you to tell us something about your background and how did you come to write the book?
Hello, Gareth. Hello, everybody who's watching or listening. My background in motorsport, I was one of many young Formula Fordsters in the late 70s when I was a teenager, right, who wanted to become the next James Hunt. My connection was with James Hunt and his family was that I was at Wellington, although much younger than James. Right. I became very friendly with his two youngest brothers, sure. David and Tim. David and I started racing karts together. Mm-hmm. And because I was a year older than him, I started racing with David. I left school a year before him, mm-hmm. and traded unashamedly on the Hunt connection, right. And used that to...
it was a big name at the time, wasn't it? I mean, I was in the sort of generation, and yes, he was a big hero of mine, and I think all teenage boys wanted to be James Hunt.
Well, absolutely, and of course he was world champion in 1976. So when I left school in the late 70s, as I say, I traded unashamedly on the connection, and it helped to a degree. It irritated my late friend David because I was a year ahead of him. But it did help. We got sponsorship from, I probably can't mention the name, but a betting house, right. Which was quite unusual at the time to go karting, and it really went from there. But in answer to your question, Gareth, it was very clear to me when I was racing Formula Ford, which was almost the karting of today. That's what everybody did, and you had different categories of people. You had people who were trust fund kids. Even in those days, or who had very wealthy business-owning fathers who could fund their habit. You had, at the other end of the scale, garagistes, so sons of garage owners perhaps, who worked 24/7 to buy a new pair of tyres or set of tyres. And you had people in the middle like me who had to go out and find sponsorship. And I proved to be reasonably adept in doing that. Some would say I proved to be more adept at finding sponsorship than my results on track delivered. There was a bit of both, in fairness. Yeah. But following on your question, there was another category of people, very clearly, probably a little bit older than the team that I was, who were very, very well funded. It became very clear that some of their funding came from rather nefarious means. And it's always interested me. We all know how, from the beginning of motor racing, how expensive it is, and it's always fascinated me as to how people have paid for it. So that was the genesis, I suppose, of the thought behind the book, or thinking behind the book. I stopped racing in 1980, having shared the track with several future Grand Prix stars, including Nigel Mansell. Right. Note that I say I shared the track rather than beat them. Although I think I did beat Jonathan Palmer, now the boss of all the race circuits, and I did beat him a couple of times. But there were several other drivers who obviously went on to great things in Formula One. Sure. I didn't. I stopped racing and went into, in my parents' phraseology, they tell me it's really about time we went and got a proper job. So I went into the city, and ultimately, I spent 30 years in investment banking. And there are a fair few rogues in investment banking as well, I might add.
I'm sure.
But the connection basically then was money and crime. I've always been interested in the commercial side, particularly of Formula One. And you may be aware, and some of these stories are covered in the book, but you may be aware that in the 1990s particularly, there were several very dodgy, shady characters.
I think yours and mine were roughly the same age. I left school in '77, so yeah, I'm sure we're about the same age. You know, and so obviously my knowledge of Formula One is the same as yours. And I know from reading the book there were characters that came up, and I thought, oh yeah, I remember him, but I didn't know their sort of background, so I found that quite interesting.
Good.
But I think you're also right. There was a period where, I mean, which comes out a little bit in the book, where there were several more entrants to Formula One than there were places on the grid, and there was pre-qualifying before you even got into qualifying.
Absolutely.
And some of those were definitely threadbare sort of organisations, and it's no surprise, I suppose, that people like that, the owners are desperate for funds, and they'll take anybody's money without really, due process is just not a concept they believe in, and understandably so. They, somebody comes along with a bundle of cash, I want to sponsor your team. Oh, great, thanks, mate. And nobody really looks at what's behind all that. But obviously, the fullness of time, that all spins out, and certainly, as I say, that period was definitely a period where there was, I think, this because there were more teams than places. I'm sure that was a feeding ground for that kind of situation. Whereas today, because the entry is so restricted, there's the teams are much more professionally run. That kind of situation, I won't say doesn't arise, but is obviously there's a lot more scrutiny before you get into Formula One.
Well, that's true, and I can't mention any names because the characters involved haven't yet been to prison. But you'd be very surprised. There are several instances in recent years, very recent years, of shady stroke dreamers. I mean, a lot of this is about dreamers who simply lie.
Yeah, there's quite a few of those in the book,
Yeah, but there have been some that aren't in the book even more recently than that. Sure. So if ever we do a second edition, you might find some additions to the roster. But
and those stories will come to more public light.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've been very careful, Gareth, that everything I've written, and if you'd had the connections I do, if you'd had the interest, which clearly you do, and a bit of the knowledge, you could have written this book. And I suspect many people who will watch this could have written it if they'd put their minds to it. So everything I've written about is in the public domain, obviously. First of all. And as the credits say, there are a lot of people who didn't want to be credited, but there are many, many people who helped me, including many of the subjects of the book. Right. So I spent a fascinating. I finally put pen to paper on this when Boris Johnson closed us down for COVID in March 2020. I'd been thinking about it and researching it for quite a long time before that, but that was when I started literally typing one-fingeredly on my laptop, and it was amazing, as I say, how much help I had from subjects of the book. Sure. And of course, COVID saved me time because we weren't allowed out, so I had to do a lot of these meetings on Zoom.
A lot of us did something in COVID. I myself did a very long article for our magazine, the Brooklands Bulletin, on Sir Henry Seagrave, and I managed to get a biography of his literally the day that we shut down, and then I had great hours of entertainment sort of researching even just a 4,000 or 5,000 word article, which I started when I wrote it was about 12,000 words and I had to slim it down. So I'm sure there are lots of people that was the impetus to do that. We interviewed before Christmas a guy who was written a book about SFH, and again, he'd done some work on his book, but I think lockdown was the impetus for that. So maybe it was one of the positives about the.
Absolutely, well, it was a useful time, and as I say, from my perspective, and just it's the first time I've written a book. Some might, if I was wise, I'd probably say it'll be the first and last time. But I've actually been asked to do another book, also to do with motorsport, which I won't tell you about now. It did save me time, because rather than travelling all over the country and maybe over Europe and into the States, I couldn't do that even if I wanted to. So an awful lot of it was on telephone interviews and Zoom interviews. So it was, as I say, good use of time.
Yeah. Yeah. So just picking up still on your background, do you think that obviously you had a background in the city, which obviously you understand the corporate world. Do you think that helped you in writing the book?
Yes, I do. Some of we've had some great reviews on the book. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but I think one of the common denominators that has been picked out from some of these reviews is the fact that there's a lot of money involved. Obviously, we know motor racing is a very expensive sport. There's a lot of Ponzi schemes reported in the book. There are a lot of fraudsters, and I've been very flattered by the comments that because I have a background in investment banking and finance, that I've been able to explain it in layman's terms.
Yeah,
that may be just the way I see it, but so I clearly it's a book on the one hand for motor racing aficionados on both this side of the world and in the US particularly, because there's quite a lot of US content. But it's also appealed, I'm told, looking at the book sales, to people who just like crime. That motor racing may not be their first sport, but they're interested in crime. And going back to your point, that there is a lot of finance-related criminality, be it money laundering or anything else. And the answer to your question is yes, I'm sure my background helps. And those are the two parallel strands. My love and passion for motor racing and of course finance, which is my professional career.
Well, obviously my background as an accountant, I can read the business side and understand
exactly. Yeah,
but I think you got the balance. I would say you got the balance right. I think the details enough without getting too detailed that the layman wouldn't understand or would get just bored with the subject. But I mean, the stories themselves are perhaps more interesting than how they got that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned there, the fascination with crime and how the book appeals to, it has a wider appeal. And I'm just writing the review of the book for the Brooklands Bulletin. I picked up on that myself as well. We do have a fascination with crime. You only need to pick up the TV schedules, the bestsellers lists, and how many of those are about crime or of sort of one sort or another. What do you think that tells us about ourselves, maybe? And, why do you think people are so interested and fascinated by it? I mean, nobody wants to be a victim of crime, but everyone's interested.
No. Well, I think if you're, as I say, if you're interested in motorsport, and, I still participate. I stopped racing in 1980, but I restarted 30 years ago, actually, this year. So I've raced every year for the last 30 years, firstly in sports cars and latterly and primarily in historics. So I'm very active in that. And I've been lucky enough to be able to afford to do that. But I'm still, I have this obsession, going back to my first point, as to how people pay for it. And you look at when Lando Norris, for example, was in, and don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting he's in any way connected with criminality or his lovely father, but he when my boys were karting, what they were doing was almost to a Formula One level standard. Huge, great motorhomes. And to your point about criminality, as I said, a lot of people are straying over the edge of legitimacy when it comes to funding their motor racing, whether it's at the karting level, Formula Ford level, even historics. There's one well-known historic racer who's just been hauled up by the authorities for something that obviously I can't mention his name. But it's happened since time immemorial. And I think there's an element, in answer to your question, of there for the grace of God go I. You made the point earlier on, if you're a struggling team owner, not just at the Formula One level, but a dreamer or a crook comes along, perhaps your due diligence, and you're strapped for cash, it's very easy to say, yeah, we'll have that, not ask too many questions. And that, of course, is rather like being receiving stolen goods, because in some ways, in some cases, and again, this is articulated in some of the chapters in the book, motor racing, particularly at the higher international level, presents a great opportunity for laundering money.
Yes, of course.
But it's also got to be pointed out that there are an awful lot of sports. Sport, sadly, if you're a purist like you and me, it's about sport, but sport has become a business. And there's a lot of crime in business. And by definition, therefore, there's a lot of crime in other sports as well. And I make that point, I think, in the introduction to the book, whether it's boxing, inevitably horse racing.
Well, we only have to look at the multitude of money that's floating around in football at the top level.
Absolutely.
And the big teams now are, they always were as registered as corporate entities, but now it's no longer the local, like the guy Jack Walker, wasn't he, at Blackburn? He was a steel magnate, made his money and put his money into his local football club.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I'd say it's true of all sports. If someone's watching this who knows more about me than horse racing, which I could probably write on the back of a postage stamp what I know about horse racing. But there's probably a very good book to be written there, and ditto with professional boxing and what have you. So it's not. I don't think that criminality is exclusive to any particular sport, and certainly not motor racing. But motor racing does throw up, as we all know, and always has done from the days of Brooklands onwards. It throws up some very interesting, very driven, excuse the pun, but very driven, ambitious, egotistical characters. And as we all know, motor racing, like many sports, but more than most, perhaps, is a drug. And it's an addiction, and addictions have to be paid for. And not everyone can afford.
Passions in general, be it sport, be it whatever, music or whatever, people lose all sense of rational decision making.
Quite right. Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, the period you've sort of covered, and I think mentioned it earlier, is pretty much the last 40 years. I know there's some earlier stories. Did you set yourself certain parameters in writing the book in that sense?
I did, but not in terms of the period in question. No. There's, for example, Luis Fontes, who was a Le Mans winner.
Yes, I saw that one. I remember
so that goes outside. So no, it absolutely was no timestamp on it, Gareth, at all. The parameters, and I need to qualify this, but the parameters initially were that someone had to have been convicted, not necessarily been to prison, because as we know, you can be convicted without going to prison.
Obviously.
But there had to be convictions. So as I say, there are several people who should be in the book, but aren't, but either because they've died without being convicted, or they just haven't been convicted yet. But the one qualification I should make, and I've had this comment from a couple of people, they were surprised when they opened the book and read, opened the contents page and saw, for example, the late Max Mosley. Now, Max was not a criminal, to be very clear, but he, was the head of the sport, obviously, as in the FIA, and he had the criminal connection he had, if you like, was his parents, who, for those who don't know, his father was leader of the Black Shirt Brigade and was interred during the war. So both his parents, and Max had a fascinating, but rather sad childhood for that reason. Both of his parents were interred actually up at a Holloway prison for 3 years of the war. So that was his criminal connection. And then, of course, he was effectively directly responsible for closing down the tabloid newspaper, the News of the World, because of his because of the way they reported his private life. So that's why he's in the book. So the book evolved, in answer to your question, away from people who were directly driven to crime, to fund their habit. But there are people who were in it who were maybe victims of crime, And a good example of that would be the last lady who ever tried to qualify for a Grand Prix. Right. And I'm not talking about Susie Wolff or...
No, Giovanna Amanti, was she called?
Amati, yeah. And she,
I remember her, yeah.
And she was, she joined the Brabham team who were, this is at the end, this is after Bernie Ecclestone had sold it. So the Brabham team was really on its way out. They by definition didn't have the best car. She was a very good driver, in fairness, and she still is a very good driver. Actually, still competing, age 60 something, I think. But so she joined at the worst time. But she was the last lady to try qualifying for a Grand Prix, and sadly failed to do so. But so why is she in the book? She wasn't a criminal. She was a victim of crime. So before she started in motor racing, and she was a great friend of Elio De Angelis, and the commonality they had, well, they were at school with each other, hence their friendships, but they also both came from very wealthy families. And the Amati story is that she was a victim of crime because she was kidnapped as a teenager. And it's an interesting story because her father was the biggest owner of cinemas in Rome. And at the time when she was kidnapped, there was a lot of political related kidnappings, which the government was very, the Italian government was very keen.
In Italy, there was a lot of very nasty sort of issues.
Very horrible stuff. A lot of it was mafia-led. And the government, quite understandably, the Italian government, quite understandably, did not want ransoms to be paid because that would encourage criminality. But if you're the father of a young teenage girl and you're wealthy enough, you want to pay the ransom. The courts or the judges decided that Signor Amati should not be allowed to pay, and they froze his assets. But because he was a cinema owner, and cinemas, these days, as we know, no one pays anything, certainly not going to the cinema in cash, but it's all on credit cards. In those days, it was all cash. It was a cash business. And it coincided rather conveniently with the launching of the first Star Wars film, which everyone knows went on to be a massive box office hit. And he was in the ideal position there to collect a load of cash. He also pawned his wife. His wife, so Giovanna's mother, was quite a well-known, retired by then, quite a well-known film actress. So she was fairly wealthy in her own right. They pawned her jewelry. Even the servants that they had working for them pawned some of their possessions, and they raised the money. So they paid the ransom against the, should we say, advice of the Italian courts. And Giovanni was then released. The police were very keen on catching the captors. One of whom was a chap called Daniel Nieto, who was a Sicilian and very much on the wanted list. And it became clear that Giovanna, when she was released, was still in touch with this chap, or I should say, this chap was in touch with her, sending her roses and everything else. So it was the opposite of Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome is when the captive falls in love with or sympathises with the captor. And whilst I don't believe, and Giovanna said categorically that was not the case, what was the case was that Nieto was obsessed with her, a much younger girl. And the bottom line is that, had she not complied with the police wishes, then she would have been, an accessory to criminality. But she did comply, and what they required was that she met up with this chap, and they did. And they had a coffee and an Italian palazzo, and the police then did a sting and swooped in and captured this guy. The story then goes. So that, if you like, was a very good example of someone who was victim of crime rather than being involved directly in criminality, and that's why she appears in that. No, there are quite a few stories.
I mean, there's the Fangio story in there as well, which is not exactly the same, but that is again a kidnapping, and the criminals, inverted commas, the terrorists or whatever, who then became obviously the Cuban leaders. I mean, that was a publicity stunt.
Oh, completely, yeah. I mean, it was a great story, maybe one of the better known stories, depending on what vintage one is and
Sure.
what area the sport one's interested in. But absolutely, they there was a Cuban Grand Prix which ran, I think, for 3 years successively. Fangio and Sterling Moss, obviously big names at the time, were the great draws.
Sure.
And it was just a publicity stunt to these bandits turned up at a reception the night before the race with guns, wielding a lot of guns, and everybody froze. They bundled Fangio into a car. They took him off to a couple of safe houses. They looked after him extremely well. The story goes, and there are various different versions of it, that he actually was able to watch the race the next day with his captors, all of whom, but by which time he actually, I think by the time he was released, I think he showed quite a degree of sympathy with their cause.
Sure.
But he wasn't harmed in any way. He
was never under threat, was he? Really?
No, not really. No, but no one knew that. But it served its purpose. It was a wonderful publicity stunt. So he was a victim of crime in that respect, of course. Yeah.
We've touched on some of the sort of, if you like, more unusual stories in the book. Do you have any particular favourites?
Well, I guess, going back to the earlier time frame, I think originally I entitled the chapter Ruth Ellis, because Ruth Ellis was not a racing driver, but Ruth Ellis, for those of us of the right vintage, and it was pretty much before my time, but was famous for being the last woman to be hanged in Britain, and that that was a massive turning point in the penal system in this country, and led ultimately to the total abolition of hanging. But for those people who don't know, that the connection with motor racing was that she had a very unfortunate life, and she wouldn't even have received, in this day and age, she wouldn't have received a life sentence, let alone hanging, obviously. So, but the reason why she appears in the book, not as a chapter in it, but she was tried and hanged for murdering her lover, who was a racing driver called David Blakely, who was a pretty unpleasant character, by the way, and had, I think one in today's terms might call it a crime of passion, but he had physically abused her. She was pregnant with his baby. She had an incredibly awful upbringing. She had been molested, certainly by her father. She had gone into prostitution. But she was definitely trying to, make a better life for herself when she came across Blakely, who she fell in love with. He was a womanizer. Anyway, long story short, she shot him outside a pub, and that's why she went we got tried and hanged. But
I thought that was one of the more one of the more fascinating chapters in the book. I think some of the stories you tell, actually, for me, told me about stories which I knew a little about, and now I know a lot about. And so I think the Ruth Ellis one was a good example. I knew who Ruth Ellis was, and I knew she was the last lady to be hanged. But to read the background to that, and I suppose I've always viewed her as somebody. I'm not an advocate of hanging, so to have been the last person to be hanged is something. But when you read the story, you think, well, that was an injustice in itself. It was wrong. So maybe we can talk about the Great Train Robbery. That's one of the great stories in there.
As I said earlier, I think I race for the last 28 years probably. I've been racing historic cars.
Right.
As I got older, so the cars. None of them are Brooklands races, but I'm very active in Formula Junior, which was the breeding ground for Formula One drivers of the time. Started by Count Johnny Laurani in Italy.
And we see races of those sort at sort of the Goodwood Revival.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm a regular at Goodwood at the Revival and in the members meeting.
Yeah.
And Formula Junior is as healthy. I think some would argue probably even healthier now than it was in period. I mean, of all the historic racing series, you can race all over the world, and you could probably race somewhere in Formula Junior every weekend of the year, quite literally. But the connection with Roy James, he was a very promising young racing driver, and he raced a Brabham in Formula Junior. But as you allude, he was also one of the great train robbers. He played a slightly bit part. I mean, and the interesting thing about it is that he was originally just a small-time cat burglar, but he was also a trained silversmith. So what he would do to go around breaking into people's houses and specifically stealing silver, which he then had the ability to go and melt down and make into other things. Some of which he sold, some items which he sold to very prestigious department stores like Harrods. Anyway,
so instead of money laundering, he was metal laundering, effectively.
Absolutely right. But there are lots of points in the story that I enjoy. So he got involved with a much bigger gang, part really because of his ability to drive fast. Everyone suggests he was the getaway driver, and that's not entirely true. He drove much less glamorous than being a getaway driver. The vehicles that the gang used to take the bullion off to a safe farmhouse were actually, there was a pair of Land Rovers, the original Defenders, or Series 1 cars, and they had an ex-army truck as well. So he was originally hired, really, to be one of the drivers, and that didn't, he wanted to use his souped-up Mark II Jaguar, but didn't. But I mean, nonetheless, he was effectively one of the getaway drivers. The story goes on, and I won't bore you with the mechanics of the Great Train Robbery, because that's pretty well chronicled. It's in the book. But he was not one of us. He was the first of that gang to be sent to prison, and by definition, therefore, the first to come out after 12 years. The first thing he did was he went to his old mate Bernie Ecclestone. Bernie, I should add, has been, and I quoted in the book, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that Bernie was behind the Great Train Robbery, but and indeed Bernie has had that suggestion levelled at him many, many times. And he's always said, I think I put in the book, no, I can't do Bernie's accent, but no, mate, it's far too small a job for me. Typical Bernie Ecclestone sense of humour. But Roy did know him from his early days in motor racing. He went to Bernie, who by that time was not the Supremo that he became in Formula One. He was simply the owner of the Brabham Formula One team.
Right. And
Roy James, his first port of call, or two of his first ports of call, one was Graham Hill, who by that time had been world champion, not once but twice, but also retired, and was running his own Formula One team, and his mate Bernie Ecclestone, who was also running a Formula One team. And he went to Bernie, he said, sorry, mate, you're 40-odd years old now, you are too old. Roy did get involved in motor racing at a very low level. He did actually have some races funded by some other people, not Bernie Ecclestone. And he tried it and wasn't very successful. But in the meantime, Bernie said, well, I will give you a job as something. And he ended up by making one of the trophies that was presented for many, many years, not to the world champion, which is a fallacy that some people repeat, but to the best, or the organisers of the best arranged Grand Prix of the year. So for many years,
for that,
and not a particularly attractive trophy, by the way, but for many years, that trophy was presented, and the recipients were all completely unaware as to the origins and who had actually made it. And dear old Roy James narrowly avoided going to prison again for being involved with one of his colleagues from the train robbery in a VAT gold bullion fraud. He got away with that amazingly. It was much bigger, but did go to prison, in fact, subsequently, because he had married a very young girl and had a young family of a couple of children. The girl he married had what we would now define as alcohol abuse problems, and Roy was having an argument or a heated discussion with her about custody of the children when her father turned up to try and broker a deal and make them both see sense. And Roy James shot him. Didn't kill him, fortunately, whether that was intent or not. But it's injured him, for which he went to prison again. But the irony was that the unfortunate father-in-law was actually a bank manager.
Right.
Which was so it sort of joined the circle up in that story. So that's one of my favourite stories.
Okay. I mean, we've touched on a lot, and I made some notes about certain stories to bring out. I think, can you tell us about Charles Brockett?
I can indeed, yeah.
And I remember that story when it was live. It was quite a story.
Gareth, you probably you and me both, and you probably read the same sort of articles as I did, and the story, which by the way is a fallacy, but the well-reported story was that Charlie Brockett broke up these cars, or cut them up, and buried them under one of the golf courses on the Brockett estate, and that a couple of cars ended up in the lake on the Brockett estate.
Right.
Which is much more romantic, but the reality is much less romantic. Right. They actually, and again, this is in the book, they actually ended up, he dismantled a couple of cars and the connection with motor racing. A is because he did race a couple of times himself. In historics, because he owned some very valuable historic cars. Yeah. B, he raced it as well, or competed in the Commons versus Lords, House of Commons versus House of Lords celebrity races that John Webb used to organise as a backup race for some of the big events at Brands Hatch. So he has a racing collection in that respect. But he had also hired as the man to be his sort of lead mechanic stroke buyer, an ex-Formula 3 racing driver called Jim Bosito, who was murdered, who was actually ripping Brockett off.
Right.
So he would say, well, Charles, there's a car here for £200,000. We really need to buy it from the States. Needs a bit of work, But in fact, he was inflating the prices. So, and that was only discovered.
And then probably creaming a bit on the restoration as well, I should think.
The whole thing. But he was literally living at Charles's expense. He was an employee of Charles's, and was seriously fleecing his boss. And he was murdered by whom? He was clearly involved in criminality, but they didn't realise until they found his body on the estate. But the story about Brockett, which most people don't realise, again, so first of all, is that the cars were not buried on the estate. Right. Secondly, that really it was his wife, who was an ex-American model who was massively narcotic dependent, to the point that she was so desperate, she used to go to hotels in the local town. Well, first of all, she'd go to pharmacists and try and get prescriptions just for painkillers, anything she could. She then resorted to going to hotels, checking in as a resident. And most hotel doctors, if you say you've got a headache, will say, okay, we'll prescribe you some pills. So that's the way she got her prescriptions, and would take them to pharmacists. She then got even more desperate because all the hotel doctors got to know her. She then started to forge prescriptions, at which point she got busted. And she was hauled up in the local police station in front of the chief superintendent, who said, she said, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Yes, Lady Brockett, we do know who you are." And a very embarrassing situation. She said, "Well, it's not me you should be going after, it's Charles." So she blew the whistle on Charles doing what he did. But the final fallacy about that, and again, this wouldn't happen in most countries, certainly most European countries. So Charles Brockett was naughty, and he, of course, well, not of course, but he was very cooperative when I was writing the chapter on him. But and he went down for putting in a fraudulent insurance claim. The reality is that the police didn't believe that the cars could have been stolen from the estate, because it's pretty secure anyway. The units they were kept in were very secure. So they had major doubts. The insurance company, and most insurance companies, will do all they can.
They're not going to write a big check without checking very carefully.
And they were very, in conjunction with the police, Gareth, they were very, very wary about it. They then said, "Well, we want to take you to court." And Charles's lawyer said, "Right, we'll go to court." They then said, "Right, we want you to put up a surety of £750,000 to ensure that if you lose, our legal bills are paid. Well, right. Charles couldn't raise £750,000. This is the time of the first Iran-Iraq war. A lot of his business, this is what led him into trouble. A lot of his business was based on American tourism. Right. The Americans stopped flying, so the business was up against it. And he certainly couldn't raise the £750,000. In the meantime, the banks who had overly lent him money, and were irresponsible in doing so, by the way, and they saw the error of their way, said, look, we recognise the pickle you're in. We'll lend you some more money on a very, very good deal, repayable over 10 years. And if you don't, they put in hurdle rates, which are explained in the book. But they were very advantageous to Charles. So Charles suddenly, he couldn't use the bank's offer of a new loan to pay for court fees. So he turned around and said, fantastic, accepted the deal from the bank. He turned around to the insurance companies and got his lawyer to say, you know what, we'll drop it. We'll go away. So the reality was he didn't claim, he was never paid one penny of insurance money.
No.
And if that had been the case in, let's say, France, he would not have gone to jail.
Right.
He put in a fraudulent claim, it's true, but he withdrew it. Right. And that's what most people don't realise. He received not one penny of insurance claim.
But the crime is submitting the claim in the first place. I mean, obviously we're talking for Brooklands TV. Do you have any Brooklyn stories? There aren't really much in the book, and I guess it's not the period you've really covered, is it? But I wondered if you. I mean, obviously we talked earlier about the kind of individuals that float about on the edges of motorsport, and some of these characters obviously have very dubious backgrounds. That must have happened back in the days of Brooklands, and Brooklands was, inverted commas, gentleman racers. I don't know if you've ever come across any interesting Brooklands stories.
Well, I think I touched on him earlier on, but actually, and this is one of the lesser known stories, but Luis Fontes. So a lot of people may have heard of him, but didn't realise that
he won the 35 Le Mans 24 hours. He virtually came from nowhere, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. He was a wealthy, despite his name. So he was a Brit, but of Brazilian parentage, and his father had multiple, should we say, I'm not sure marriages so much as associations. So he had children by several different ladies, quite a few of them in this country, and he, I believe, was
like a lot of British racing drivers of that time. There was one proving ground where everybody started at Brooklands, or pretty much.
I'm pretty sure, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I'm pretty sure he was a Brooklands racer. But I think there'll be a lot of people who will be aware of and much more knowledgeable about this era of motorsport than I was. It definitely was before my time, and in fairness, before my level of interest. But most people, if they've heard of him and know that he was the winner, as you say, of the Le Mans 24 Hours in 1935, would not know that he went to prison. And he went to prison for getting into effectively a race on the roads with somebody else, which which was thoroughly irresponsible and led to a young motorcyclist losing his life, for which, which was a tragedy. And he was something of he was a very bookish looking, no disrespect to you, Gareth, but he could be, if you met him or seen him. Well, no, I wouldn't say his brother, but he could be an accountant. He was a very serious demeanour, but in fact was a speed freak. Went into powerboat racing when he came out. So he was also a very well-known. He competed in aircraft races as well. Went into powerboat racing as well. And then when the war came, he got involved in flying for the ATA, so delivering airplanes around the country, and that's how he died. He died crashing. An airfield in South Wales, which is, a tragic end to a young life. But as I say, he went to prison for being thoroughly irresponsible, and in fact, and it's a chapter worth reading because he was a colourful character, and had already had brushes with the law prior to the accident that killed the motorcyclist. But I think in answer to your question, I think racking my brain, but I think he's the only person in the book who would have been a Brooklands racer. But that's not to put any of your viewers off reading it, because I think if you're interested in motorsport of any era, you'll find some interesting things in this.
Now, I'd say there's sort of a little bit of a parallel with one of the stories that's in the book. Fontes' background, and I think I'm right in saying he did a little bit of racing at Brooklands.
Yeah.
Suddenly he's racing at Le Mans, and he actually won it. Sort of has parallels a little bit with Rob Walker's story and the Rob Walker's Delahaye, which is covered in the book in another story concerning a character called Guy Jason Henry, and this is post-war, and we won't go into that story, but he was convicted. Well, he wasn't convicted in the end, but he did try and smuggle 3,000 watches back into the country.
Absolutely right.
In the fuel tank of the Delahaye, and that car is actually at Brooklands. It's owned by Rob Walker's son, who's Robbie Walker, and yes, in fact, Mark and I did a video about that car about 18 months ago. But and I believe the false fuel tank that was used on that particular incident is in a museum in Cornwall, which is the Museum of Smugglers or something. So,
oh, really?
I
didn't know that.
But just to be, say, Rob Walker, similarly, he bought that car, did a bit of racing at Brooklands, and hey, it's Le Mans next month, let's go over and race in that.
Yeah.
And that's a story in itself, but we haven't got time for it here. Now, one of the more interesting stories, I thought, was the story of Sid Miller. What can you tell us on that story?
Well, the title of the chapter, Gareth, is, as you rightly say, is on Sid Miller. But actually, there were really two characters involved, Sid Miller and his friend and colleague, John Bellord. Right. And they were genuinely do-gooders. But for anybody, again, of a certain age, so when I was racing in Formula Ford, there were an awful lot of cars that appeared on the circuits with the name ostensibly being sponsored by either national organs or southern organs.
So I thought it was one of the more bizarre stories in a way, but
it is completely bizarre, and it's worthy of all the chapters in the book, in my view, or all the stories in the book, in my view, is worthy of a Netflix or some such documentary or film. And in fact, there are people, nothing to do with me, but who are looking at that particular story. Right. But it's a very improbable story of two eccentric bachelors who became Anglican lay preachers. They were running ostensibly a retirement home down in Sussex, and they got involved. They recognised the fact that because of their religious connections, an awful lot of churches had ropey old organs. And at that time, in the 70s, there was a newfangled musical instrument called an electronic organ.
Right.
And they started selling or trying to sell. They sounded, the quality was very high, and they were trying to sell these things to churches at very big ticket items, very, very big ticket prices. And not surprisingly, some of the churches couldn't afford them, but said, yeah, we'd really like one of these, but we can't afford it. So they fell upon effectively a pyramid scheme. They would get unsuspecting victims, for want of a better word, to sponsor or part sponsor the acquisition cost of an organ for their local church. So that the individuals felt they were doing something to help their local church, and everyone was happy. They then extended that to racing drivers. And as you alluded earlier in the show, people will do anything, for if they think it'll help them. In this case, at a club level, if they think it'll help finance their motor racing costs. One of the first people they went to was a racing driver who some people will know, who's still very active, called Will Arif. Will actually did get real sponsorship from them. But most of the drivers, most of the many drivers who had sponsorship on the side of their cars did not. What they did get was a commission. So they would say, the Miller and Bellord would say, look, you go and find us half dozen people, literally like a pyramid scheme, who'll put money into churches, church organs, and then we'll give you a commission effectively. And for that commission, you can put our name on the side of your cars. They at the time, they were very high profile, that the companies who no one had ever heard of 2 years before became very high profile. And they started sponsoring the various national championships. But there were several well-known drivers, some of whom are mentioned in the book. The late Jeff Friswell, who was an incredibly talented driver in Clubman's, and was given the opportunity or the promise that if he went on raising money, they would get him into Formula 2 and then into Formula 1. Of course, it never happened. And he ended up, as did a lot of other drivers, losing a lot of money by his connections with Miller and Bellord. But the interesting part of the story was that actually what they were doing is that they were organising hire purchase deals on these organs, and they were selling one organ but taking out several different hire purchase agreements, and robbing Peter to pay Paul. They were using some of the money they'd raised from innocent racing drivers and family and friends and whatever to pay that off. But it was born genuinely, initially, of them wanting to do good. The whole empire collapsed. They realised it collapsed. They had a young chap they'd taken on called Jeff Green, who has written his own book and who was immensely cooperative when I was writing this story. Lovely, lovely chap. Completely innocent in terms of the fraud, but he did a lot of building work for these chaps, and ultimately they recognised the fact that the business was literally falling down like a pack of cards, and they needed to disappear. So they had a farewell party. They said to the residents of the care home and all their supporters, we haven't had a holiday for 2 years. We're going to France. So they made a big show. A helicopter picked them up on the lawn of the house, took them off to France. They sent postcards back from France to all their friends, and then disappeared. And they came back on the ferry. Jeff Green picked them up, took them up to a remote Scottish island. He rode them out, or they had a small outboard motor, rode them out to this almost a rocky outcrop, on which they lived for 6 months. With no sanitation, bare amounts of food. It was quite extraordinary.
It was a very bizarre story, really.
It really was. I mean, they basically what they did is they evaded the authorities. It was a very clumsy attempt at faking suicide, and they said they escaped to live as fugitives in this bothy with no roof and the barest of essentials. Amazingly made it back to coast, and then lived in a B&B until their money ran out. They'd taken a briefcase full of money, at which point they phoned the hapless Mr. Green, who by then, of course, had been interviewed by the police, and by then, he had ruined his own reputation because he was left holding the baby, although it was nothing to do with him. And he then rightly shot them. The police turned up at this B&B in Scotland, arrested them, and they went to prison. But they, as I say, they lived for, I think it was 260 odd days as fugitives on this island. It was quite extraordinary. And there was a major connection with motor racing. They even had their name, I think it was the 1975 British Grand Prix at Silverstone, which was a very wet race and made an awful lot of drivers that stopped early because of a downpour. But Dave Morgan was sponsored by Southern Organs, or National Organs, in his 30s, TS15, I think it was.
I mean, the putting National Organs on the side of your car, it almost feels like something that Clarkson had put on a Top Gear stuff, where they put silly names on the side of cars, which are...
Absolutely.
It sounds like a Clarkson joke.
It does, but it was for real, and it is the most extraordinary story. I mean, it's not the sort of sponsor anyway you'd associate with motor racing, let alone Formula One. But no.
Okay, and slightly different story. Tell us about Angela Harkness.
Yeah, she was again, not quite in the Ruth Ellis mould, but she had a very unstable life, really, from the word go. She was born, and Angela Harkness sounds like a perfectly Western, American name, but in fact she was christened up or born Fatima Karikhani in Iran, into a very large family who ended up fleeing into Western Germany when she was, I think, about 3 years old, and that was during the Iranian Revolution.
Right.
So she had a.
So that'd be late 70s.
That would be 76, something like that. Yeah. And then she bettered herself for sure. She allegedly gained a degree in psychology. If she did, then that certainly stood her in good stead for what she subsequently did. She ended up by leaving age around about as a teenager, maybe 20 years old. She went to Texas with four of her sisters in the mid-90s, then moved to California and started working under the name of Angela, started working as a stripper in a nightclub called the Candy Cat. She got involved with some unsavory people. She ripped off one of her husbands. It was nothing to do with motor racing, but she actually created a NASCAR team, which was entirely funded and very cleverly funded by fraudulent bank loans. She literally didn't pay for anything at all. She scammed the sport. She fled the country. She left behind a dead husband. She didn't murder him, and also a business partner and a lover who all languished in prison. And in doing so, she bankrupted. She had a very small sponsor, a real sponsor, whom she bankrupted, and she left in her wake a trail of broken promises and bunch checks and unpaid employees. But it was, an extraordinary story. So many people went out of their way to help her and her partners, and they capitalized from the goodwill that had been created by these people. So literally at every turn, including people she bought equipment from, to people who actually did put their name on the side of her cars. One of her drivers ended up by being the hero of the piece by repaying some of the employees out of his own pocket, who'd been made redundant or not been paid wages. But she was a stripper. That's how she started.
Obviously, her charm extended a bit more than just stripping.
Absolutely,
she was able to get this money out of people.
Yeah, but she duped lots of innocent people at every single level, whether it's the banks, her partners, her lovers, her husbands, her sponsors, her employees. It was extraordinary, and very calculated. But she started her life as a stripper.
Wow. Okay. I found your book very interesting. I think our talk's been very interesting, and you've been very eloquent in explaining some of the stories. I'm sure I could ask you many, many more questions, and I think we'll call that a wrap. And I'd very much like to thank you for your time. I've very much enjoyed talking to you, and as I said before, the book's fascinating, and I wish you all the best with it. And thanks for talking to us on Brooklands TV.
Great pleasure, Gareth. Thank you very much as well.
Thank you. Goodbye.